Alright, so this is my second attempt at putting together some sort of brief showcase of what a soft modded Wii can do, because in my first attempt here, I ended up rambling about different video standards for like 15 minutes, and it was kind of stupid. So, we're gonna ignore all of that, mostly, not entirely, we'll see, and just talk about what you can do with a homebrewed Wii, because there's quite a lot, and I recommend these as a good starter kit for someone who wants to play old video games in a way that at least feels somewhat authentic. If you have a Wii with composite AV cables and a tube TV, you can get a very close experience to having the original hardware for something that costs significantly less than actually having the original hardware. So I've set up this display here using this tube TV I've got because I really like this TV and I think it's cool and I like showing it off, even though it was an absolute pain to get the video recording in a way that wasn't flickering or with lines across the screen, and then I'll start talking about refresh rates and interlaced versus progressive and all sorts of video standards that may or may not interest you. But the main thing to know is that the difference between playing old games on like an emulator on your computer versus on your Wii, which in most cases they are still being emulated, is the video output. And that makes a huge difference in my opinion. So I'm going to load up this SD card menu, which is where I have a whole bunch of Virtual Console games, many of which were downloaded legitimately from the Wii Shop channel back in the day. Many you could not get because they were not available. I've got some things that were never available to download. Once this loads, I'll point some of them out. This does take a moment to load. Super Mario All-Stars, that was never on the Virtual Console. DuckTales 2. Was DuckTales 1 available? I don't know. DuckTales 2 wasn't. Mega Man 6, because for whatever reason, Mega Man's 1 through 5 were available, but 6 was not. And then I've also got 9 and 10 here. But yeah, basically, apart from Nintendo 64 games, these Virtual Console games will display at the same output resolution as their original hardware. So you get a much more authentic feeling experience than if you were just playing, a Super Nintendo emulator on your PC. You get the look of the original games. So we're going to load up Super Mario World real quick. So I'll see if I can do a zoom in at some point soon, showing that in this case you can see the individual scan lines, meaning the 240 roughly lines of video that were output by old game consoles. And it looks, basically this looks just like if I had an actual Super Nintendo plugged in here. So you get a very good experience. It feels almost as if you have the hardware. And if you have, basically, real quick, the only hardware you need to set all of these things up is a PC with an SD card slot. And this isn't a tutorial, but it's more just like an introduction to what you can do with not very much. A PC with an SD card slot, an SD card, I'd recommend, 32 gigabytes or something. This one's 64, but I've had some weird issues with it that I'm not going to go into. A Wii remote, a classic controller, and that's it. And the AV cables and the power cable and all that stuff to hook up your Wii. That's basically it. With just that equipment, you can have access to a huge amount of NES, Super NES, N64, Sega Master System, Sega Genesis. Those are the main systems I'd say you get a very good experience with for just about any game you could think of. For N64, I don't know if I mentioned that just now, but for N64, you mainly want to stick to the releases that were made available by Nintendo. There are standalone N64 emulators, but they kind of are terrible. So for the most part, the N64 games that are available are the ones that were available back in the day, and I'm doing terrible here, not that it really matters, but it's still a decent selection. I will point out N64 games don't play at their original 240p resolution. They're upscaled to 480i, which is not quite as authentic as everything else here, but it works decently well for those games because the polygons do look nicer at a higher resolution versus something like pixel art that you don't want to upscale to 480i because then it just becomes flickery and blurry. So I have NES, SNES, N64 games installed on here, and some arcade games and some WiiWare games like Mega Man 9 and 10. Sega Master System and Sega Genesis games are somewhere else because there's a really excellent Sega emulator available that's real easy to use, has a ton of features, and just works great. So yeah, a whole bunch of stuff here, but I got some stuff elsewhere, and we're going to go into the homebrew menu because this is where all the options open up for things you can load, because here it's basically an app launcher for anything. There's tons of custom software, there's emulators. The main ones that are important here is this one, Genesis Plus GX. This is a fantastic Sega Master System, Genesis, and Sega CD. I didn't mention Sega CD earlier. We've got an Atari one that works all right. Now, apart from the systems I mentioned, there are other systems that you can get decent enough results with. That being Atari 2600. There are separate emulators for Super Nintendo and NES. I prefer the Virtual Console games for the most part, mainly because of input lag. I feel like these separate emulators are a bit laggier. Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance is available, with mixed results. You get some weird audio issues, there's some slowdown for Game Boy Advance games, but it's definitely here and it's definitely workable if this is something you want to do. And then, apart from emulation, the Wii can play GameCube games natively. So you've got this app, Nintendo, that you can load GameCube ISOs directly from an SD card, and it plays them natively. It's not emulating. There's a similar loader for Wii games. I don't remember what it's called because I don't actually use it. I just actually play my Wii discs because there's not enough room on my SD card to rip Wii discs, really. But it is possible to do that as well. I have this app here that rips GameCube and Wii discs, and that's how I get the files to load. But let's look at the Genesis emulator real quick, because this is the other main one I use. If you want to go the simple route for things that work really well, NES, SNES, N64 games through Virtual Console, and you can find those online if you look for them, and then Sega Master System, Genesis, and Sega CD games through this emulator here. And that's all you need for... Oh, and then GameCube through Nintendo. I would recommend that. And that's all you really need for a very thorough setup that works great, gives you a ton of games to play, and very authentic ways to enjoy them with very little compromise. So, load up something like Outrun, because I've been playing a lot of Outrun lately. That's the Master System version, actually. I thought I was choosing the Genesis one. I don't think I have it in this menu here. But yeah, same situation as with most of the Virtual Console systems. Original 240p resolution, looks very authentic. There are tons of options. Like here, I can switch it from original to interlace. So now we're in 480i, which actually doesn't look that bad. But if you're familiar with the difference between what that looks like, to me this looks more like, oh yeah, I'm running an emulator. Versus if you set it to original or 240p, you could fool me into thinking that this was an actual Master System. The difference is subtle, but it's there. Like, let's load. I have a separate menu of games that I actually own the carts for, but it's kind of out of date. Let's go to Outrun for the Genesis. Like, this looks great, and this emulator works really well. There's very little, effectively no input lag. Like, maybe some people would disagree, but I'm really picky about that sort of stuff. And this emulator passes with flying colors. Like, it's fantastic. I would honestly say that if I could not have a Sega Genesis to use for whatever reason, this would be good enough. This is a very, very good experience. Probably the best standalone emulator for something like this that I've ever used. And that's why I specifically recommend it over what was available on the Virtual Console for Genesis games. Just play Outrun for a minute. Anyways, so back to the loader here. And again, this isn't a tutorial. I know I'm skipping over how I set all of this up, but it's not one thing that was set up. There's the process of actually getting the Homebrew channel installed. There's the process of, installing Virtual Console games through WAD files. There's the process of loading up these emulators. There's several different steps to this, and yeah, it can be a little intimidating at first, but there are lots of guides out there. If I was covering how I set this all up, this would be, a 5-hour video covering many different topics. But here's a very good GameCube loader. The interface is kind of plain, but it works great. You can have it use your SD card as the memory card instead of actually having to have a GameCube SD card. You can have it use the classic controller as your controller instead of actually needing a GameCube controller. Like I said, all you need is a Wii remote and a classic controller to do all of this. I don't even think you need a Wii sensor bar because you can control the cursor in most Wii menus with just the classic controller. So I've got a whole bunch of GameCube games loaded on here. If I load one of these up, because I have everything set to native settings, native control on, memory card emulation off, all that sort of stuff, it's going to treat it as if I was actually using the GameCube controller and GameCube memory card, so I won't be able to back out of it with this classic control afterwards, but all you have to do is turn native control off and you get classic controller support. Like, let's load up, Super Mario Sunshine. I'm going to have to actually turn the Wii off to get out of this afterwards, but that's okay. And there it is. It's basically an identical experience to if you were using an actual GameCube from this point out. And the GameCube does display in 480i, but that's correct. That's what GameCube games originally ran in, unless you have component cables and are specifically trying to get 480p. But again, if we're talking about using an old tube TV like this, 480i is what the GameCube generally displayed out of. So, turn this off. I have a ridiculous setup here to record all of this in the first place. Because, I'm just doing this out of my apartment for fun. Like, look, I'm recording my audio on an iPad, and I have my phone taped to the back of my chair, filming the TV, and that's how I'm even seeing any of this. It's a pretty stupid setup. But, yeah, there's a ton you can do with a Wii with Homebrew on it, and it's an excellent experience for someone who wants to be able to play old games. Like, that's all I want this video to basically say, is like, hey, if you're interested in playing old games in a way that feels semi-authentic, yeah, you got to do some research and learning how to set all this stuff up. But for very little money, because Wiis are dirt cheap and very little equipment, you can get a very authentic experience for several different consoles. And yeah, the Wii was my main old game system station for years before I started looking into actually collecting some of this old hardware. And I'd still very strongly recommend it. It's great. You can do a ton with it, and you don't lose any of the functionality of your actual, stock Wii system stuff. Like, I can still play Wii discs and GameCube games and anything and everything. I can just do a whole lot more now. And we're going to close this out with some Super Mario Kart, because I actually love this game, and I feel like it's incredibly underrated. And it plays great on here. If you do some searching online, you can actually find Super Nintendo controllers that came with the Super Nintendo Mini that Nintendo sold a few years back that work as classic controllers on the Wii. They're missing the thumbsticks because Super Nintendo controllers never had that, so you can't navigate menus with it. But once you're in the game, you can plug that in, and it's as authentic as you can get without having an actual Super Nintendo, and it's a great way to play this game. That's a bit of a tangent, but anyways, Super Mario Kart's fun. Go get a homebrewed Wii so you can play Super Mario Kart. Or just play it on Switch Online if you're like most people and don't actually care to set this all up, which is fine. But, this is cool. This is more cool than that. This is more fun than that. This feels more authentic than that. This gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling of, playing an old game. And, that's what it's all about.